So before I get into it, small disclaimer. I've noticed from the meetings I've had the past couple of days and the other talks that I've seen that it's very business focused, what's been going on here at PGC. This talk is not so much business focused, it's really more my experience as an indie developer. I still think it's valuable for anyone to have a listen because a lot of people like me are out there and a lot of people like me are, for a lot of you, the clients that you want to get. So, the quiet middle, or how I stopped worrying and learned to do pretty okay as an independent developer making mobile games. I'm Fulmer Kelly. I've been making games since late 2012, starting with Flash games when that was still a thing. And over time, I moved on to mobile games almost exclusively. So I run a studio called Sets and Settings, where I release stuff that is 100% my own. I do design, art, music, code, and all the practical stuff that comes along with making mobile games. So we're talking writing App Store descriptions, doing the trailers, all those kind of things. The last game that I released was published by Nitro, and it's called Magic Mansion, and it came out last week. I also I release games with a friend and fellow indie, Colin Lane, who does not have a company name at all, so I thought it was only fair that I would screenshot a tweet of him talking about poop emojis. So that's not really a company structure, we call it an ongoing collaboration, because we both like to do our own things as well. So essentially, I run 1.5 mobile studios. And the most recent game we did together was called Dunkers, which came out about 6 weeks ago. So a lot of you probably don't know who I am, and you probably don't know my games. And I make a pretty decent living. So I've been traveling around a lot this year, going to Pocket Gamer events. I was at Gamescom. I go to indie meetups as much as possible. I just try to meet indies, talk about their games, share experiences. What I found interesting this year is that, excuse me, a lot of people have a lot of misunderstandings when it comes to mobile games. Whenever I tell people I make mobile games, I get a lot of misconceptions and assumptions that people tell me, and I'm like, that is completely not my experience. Which means that a lot of these conversations end up as me talking about what mobile games are really about, in my experience anyway. So I thought, I'm going to have that conversation with as many people as possible, which I'm doing right now. So there are a couple of things I hear when I have these conversations. One of them being, I thought you needed to spend millions on marketing to compete on the App Store. And usually that is backed up by the idea that because there are thousands of games coming out every day, you need to spend the money on the marketing to compete at all. The second one is kind of insulting to me. I thought you had to get lucky, or I thought you had to go viral to compete on the App Store. So basically, people have this idea that there is no middle ground. People think that you either have these gigantic mega hits, or like the big company stuff, or the really viral Flappy Bird kind of things that just happen, or you have complete failures. And that's pretty much why I call this the quiet middle, because we don't really have this conversation so often. So why I think that these misconceptions happen is it's just not very sexy talking about being okay. People want to hear about really big successes. People want to know about Crossy Road and how many millions they made. Or people want to hear about the huge failures. Like, that's always a fun post-mortem when you see that someone worked for 5 years on a game and then they made like $8. Hashtag not woe. So here's a screenshot from an article about the indie apocalypse, which I'm sure we've all heard about. So I just Googled Indiepocalypse for this one. I took the first article I found, which was an article about decline in Steam sales and Steam visibility. And this was one tiny paragraph somewhere in the middle. I have no idea why that needed to be there. It's an entire article about PC gaming, and then they throw in as an aside, also mobile gaming is completely screwed, so you can't make it there. So that's one of the reasons I think that I get these perceptions from people. So in my experiences, none of those things are really true. Like, my experience is completely different. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run through my history in the App Store. And note, this will mostly be about the Apple App Store. I do release on Android as well, but it's only recently that I started to get a little more successful in that market. So I don't feel I have enough experience to really talk about that with any authority. And note that I will be keeping the floor open for questions afterwards. So, game one is the first one we released. It's called Wheelie Legend. It did nothing. It had no features whatsoever. It didn't have any downloads. I think it was like maybe 1,000 at most. For some reason, it still does okay in Finland. Thank you, Finland. That was the only thing that it actually did well. It ended in free sports racing #1 slot in Finland for a while. So thanks a lot for that. But despite the failure that this was, it was important for us because we learned a lot from it. We learned what not to do. We learned how the App Store works, because keep in mind, we're 2 people, and sometimes I'm 1 person. We don't have people employed who know specifically how to deal with all these things. We don't have employees at all. So we have to figure this out by doing, and that's going to be a recurring theme in the rest of this presentation. So after that, we released a game called Golf is Hard, which is where we started to figure out what kind of niche we wanted to mess with, which is essentially what we now call wacky physics. They're extremely silly games, and they are very much physics-based. They're free to play, and they're easy for people to get into. So this is where we started to figure out, okay, that's the kind of thing that's going to work. So that was featured for 3 days. So what happened was, this is where we learned about timing and that the App Store is an organic thing. Because what happened was, every December the App Store closes, and we had no idea about this. They freeze the store, and you can't release any new games. They don't change the features. And then when that is over, they, depending on how the dates fall for the next year, you get half a week of features, and then they switch it over again. So that's what happened to us, and that's where we learned that the App Store is also something that you have to keep in mind. So that's another lesson. After that came our baby. This is wrestling. It's our favorite game ever. It's a wacky physics wrestling game. And we actually thought that it was kind of too retro and too weird to do anything, but it got featured. An actual feature this time. And I went a little too fast for that. And this is where we really started hitting our stride. We figured out these are the kind of games that we want to make. We also figured out how we want to deal with them, how we want to monetize them, how we want to present ourselves to players. And this is when we figured we started making a somewhat sustainable studio if we would keep going with this. So at this point, 3rd game in, we started seeing actual real revenue. I started making like $3,000 a month or something, which for 1 person is pretty good. So this is what we wanted to keep iterating on. And 8 weeks later, we released Battle Golf, which did really well. It got the Best New Games feature, and it still pops up in a lot of sub-feature categories that Apple tends to do. You have a lot of party games. It's probably on there right now. party games feature, local multiplayer feature, and this is when we started realizing that we can really do something sustainable if we keep going with the things that we love and what we know that works. So after that, we decided, well, that's all great in theory, but let's do something else completely now. So we did Wheelie 2, which is the sequel to Wheelie Legend, our first game. I guess we wanted to vindicate ourselves with the failure of that game. And for once, we decided not to use pixel art, which was a mistake, I feel, in the end. So it did get a feature, and one really important thing is this is where we learned about cross-promotion within our apps. So what happened was it did okay, but it didn't do as good as our previous game, Battle Golf. It didn't even do as good as Wrestling, even though that was a super weird game. But it did okay, but the most important part was we started putting cross-promotion links in that game to our other apps. And from that point on, every time we release something, or if we release an update even, all the other ones, they get a revenue boost as well. And that is, for sustainability, that's really important. So then, after quite a break, because in between here I started working on a couple of my own projects, we did Dunkers, which came out fairly recently, and that sort of hits all of the notes that I've been talking about before. It did the cross-promo, it monetized the way that we wanted to, which we feel is respectful to our players, and it did really well. It got the feature, we actually got a banner feature, it got editor's notes, it stayed on the front page for 3 weeks straight, which was total luck, I must admit, because what happened was there was some sort of Olympics feature thing going on, and then there was some basketball week, NBA maybe, I don't know, going on, so it stayed there for a long time, and we ended up doing 2 million downloads actually in a week. So that was quite nice. And 1 week ago, I released a game through a publisher, Magic Mansion, which also did quite well. It got the feature, it got the banner feature. Because a lot of this was my publisher's work, I don't have that much to say about it, except what's interesting for me, and what maybe is interesting for other people, is that the way that this collaboration happened is I tweeted about the game while I was working on it, and they were interested, and they looked at my previous work, all the games I just showed you, and that got them interested enough to reach out, and so we made a deal. And editors knows. So in conclusion, there is space for indies on the App Store. You're not competing with like 1,000 releases a day because 990 of them are garbage. It's just not a thing. That's like, yeah. You don't have to compete with the big companies because they invest millions and they make millions, but you know, if you're a small indie, if you make, you know, like a couple thousand a day, you're pretty good. And the one that is still extremely insulting to me whenever I hear it, it's not about luck. You just have to know what you're doing, why you're doing it, you have to see what works. So essentially, experience and trial and error are your best friends in creating a sustainable indie studio over time. I cannot stress that enough. I'm going to end it there.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? There's one over here, Elspeth.
Hi. As a fan of wrestling and battle golf.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to ask you that how exactly did you monetize it? Because I don't actually remember seeing anything that, you know, I should or could have paid for.
Well, the thing about it is, that is my bad. I kind of glanced over that. So what we started learning was, you know, a lot of people do rewarded video ads. we do those as well, except that we're extremely generous with them. So what you see in a lot of games is you watch an ad, you get like 20 coins or whatever. I guess Crossy Road started that trend. What we do is we have unlockable characters. Actually, in wrestling, it was hats. And we just say, like, you watch a video, you get a hat. And that everyone told us actually not to do that because it's way too generous and you're not going to retain people, yada yada. But it turns out the people who like our games, who like playing our weirdness, they really appreciate that kind of simple monetization. It's not confusing. So we started doing that in subsequent games as well. It works really well in Dunkers, where you can unlock characters through finishing achievements or just watch one video, you get the whole character forever. Good question, thank you.